Hi everybody, this is Burke Holland and welcome back to HTML5 development for ASP.NET developers. In Module 1 we talked about jQuery and how to get started with that in ASP.NET and Visual Studio, and today we're going to be talking about services. So specifically JSON, Web API, and of course REST. So before we can talk about those things, let's talk a little bit about REST and JSON. What is REST? REST is representational state transfer. REST is the idea that we're going to let HTTP do the talking when we interact with the services. So the HTTP request will define if we're going to do a create or an update or a delete or a simple get. And that's done through HTTP verbs get, put, post, and delete. And we'll additionally let the server tell us if there's an error by using HTTP status codes, 200 for OK, 404 for not found, or 500 for server error. And what REST does is it allows us to have much cleaner URLs. So instead of having a URL where we call a method with get customer by ID and then pass in the ID that way, we instead get a nice clean URL where we call the customer's endpoint and we pass the ID in along with the URL to get back the customer with that ID. Now REST is pretty complicated, or can be complicated if we talk about all of it and try to be completely RESTful, but we're going to be as RESTful as we can in this demonstration. The other thing that we need to talk about before we get started is this idea of JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And the idea here is that you may be familiar with SOAP and XML, and on the left hand side you see a SOAP response. And the fact of the matter is that SOAP is kind of gross. It's very verbose. XML is hard to read. It's good for computers. It's hard for people to parse and understand. JSON, on the other hand, is simple. JSON is easy for us to read, and it's very easy for JavaScript to read as well and to parse out. And as we create these HTML5 JavaScript UIs, it's going to be very important that the data is in JSON format so that the UI can parse it and read it, and also so that we can parse it and read it as well. And you'll see that as we create these JSON services, that things become much easier all around. So with that primer on JSON and REST, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, I've got Visual Studio fired up here, and I have a ASP.NET Web Forms project that I've called Hello Services. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to add some structure to this application. So I'm going to add a couple of folders. The first one's going to be called Data, and this is where I'll put my data access layer. And the second folder is going to be called Controllers. And this folder is going to hold the Web API controllers, which are actually going to return the data for the Web API RESTful service. Now that I have these folders created, I want to add my data access layer. And I'm going to use link to SQL because link to SQL is very simple and I like simple. So I'm going to come here and add a new Northwind context since I'm using the Northwind database. From the Server Explorer, I will pull out the employees table and save that. And that's good for now. Now the next thing that we need to do is, of course, add Web API to this project. So we'll go ahead and add a library package reference, select online, and we'll go out to NuGet and search for ASP.NET Web API. And you'll see that there are quite a few options here, which can be a little confusing, but we want this ASP.NET Web API. So I'll click Install and accept the dependencies. I'm also going to install jQuery while I'm out here. Click Install. And there we go. Now that we've added Web API to the project, I need to go ahead and add a controller to this controllers folder here that will return data for the employees table. So I'm going to add a new class and I'm going to call it employees controller. And it's important to note that Web API uses convention over configuration. And what that means is that it's actually looking for things to be named a certain way. So if we make a call in the URL to API/employees, it's going to be looking for a controllers folder and an employees controller. You can change that, but that's the default, so it's important that things are named this way. Now that I've created this controller class, I need to go ahead and inherit from the API controller. And you can see that Visual Studio doesn't recognize this right away, but if I hover over this pop-up here and import this system.web.http namespace, we're good to go. And this class will contain methods that can be called either get, put, post, or delete. They can actually be called anything you want, but then if you have to specify which verb they respond to. If you specify them as get, put, post, or delete, they will respond to an HTTP get, put, post, or delete. Let's start with a get. Before we can return any data, I need to declare the Northwind data context here. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a new Northwind data context. There we go. And then I will create a public method, and it's going to be a get, which will return a list of linked to SQL employee objects, and I'll call this a get. And it's not going to take any parameters because we're going to return all of the employees. So I'll go ahead and create a query which selects from the context and returns all of the employees in the employees table in the Northwind database. And then I'll go ahead and return the employees. Now by default, linked to SQL returns an iQueryable, and we actually need this in a list. So I'm going to say toList here. And then I also didn't specify the employees table on the end. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now before we can actually call this controller and this get method here, we need to set up the default routing for WebAPI. So I'm going to go into the global.asax.cs file here. I'm going to do a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the, there we go, system.web.http namespace. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a default route for WebAPI. I'm even going to call it default API. And the template will be the URL that is API / the name of the controller with an optional ID parameter. And that will map back to this employees controller here. And like I said, it's important that things are named a certain way so WebAPI knows how to match things up. So now that I've created this, I can just save, and then we can go out and take a look at the application. So I'll start it up. Our application's loaded, and I'm going to go ahead and type in API employees. And you'll see that we get an error here. And this error doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if we look at the detail, and I expand this out, you can see that object graph contains cycles and cannot be serialized. The reason for this is that linked to SQL objects are fairly complex, and they contain not just the data, but information about relationships and the database itself. So I'm going to go ahead and change this so that instead of trying to return an object that .NET has trouble serializing, we can create a simple object that it will have no problems with. So I'm going to create a folder and call it models. And in the models folder, I will create an employee model that I'm just going to call employee. And I'll return a list of these objects instead of the linked to SQL objects. Each one of these employee objects will represent one row in the Northwind database. I'm not going to use all of the columns in the Northwind database for this demonstration, but we'll create a couple. So there we go. I've created a couple of properties here, and I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then in the controllers file, instead of returning a list of the employee linked to SQL objects, I want to return a list of model objects and the employee models. Now, I need to get these linked to SQL objects in that format, and I could do that by selecting a new models.employee for each record that's in the linked to SQL employees context here. And then I can use this object notation, press Control Spacebar, and get a list of properties from the employees class that I can assign to. So I'll say the ID is equal to the employee ID coming out of the database, and I'll map the rest of the fields much the same way. Okay, there we go. I've got everything mapped and everything's looking good. So let's go ahead and start the application and see if we get a different result. So I'm going to go ahead and type in API/employees. And you can see that this time Internet Explorer is trying to download a file. Now I'm going to take this over and look at it in Chrome for just a second here. So let's open up a new instance of Google Chrome, and I will put in this URL and then /API/employees, and there we go. Now you can see that IE was trying to download this XML file, but Chrome just displays it. And this is the data that's coming out of the database, and it's an XML format. And the list, the generic list, was translated to an array. So WebAPI doing a lot of nice work for us. But this is in XML, and we need it in JSON format. So let's look about how we can get this data in JSON format using jQuery. The first thing that we need to do is, of course, add a reference to jQuery. So here in the master page at the top, underneath the site.css link, I'm going to drag in jQuery. If you remember, we installed this from NuGet when we got the Web API packages as well. So I'm going to drag this in, and save this, and we're good. And then over in the default.aspx page, what I want to do is I want to get the data from our service as JSON, bring it back, and put it into an employees table. So I'm going to create a new table element, and I'm just going to set its ID equal to employees. There we go. And I'm going to open up a script block. Inside the script block, I want to create a document ready function. Inside of this function, the first thing that I want to do is create a variable, and I'll call this employees, and I want to set this variable equal to the employees table that's in the page. So I can select it with the jQuery selector. So this returns the employees table, but it actually returns it wrapped in a jQuery object. And I personally put a $sign in front of all of my variables that are wrapped in jQuery, so I know later on in my code, that's a jQuery object. I can execute jQuery functions against it. The next thing we want to do is we actually want to make the Ajax call back to the server to get the data from the WebAPI service. This is another thing that jQuery is very, very good at, and that is making Ajax very trivial and simple. So if I hit the $sign and look at the IntelliSense, and then I hit a dot to call the method, we can see there's an Ajax method here. This is the one we want. I'm going to open up the method here, and you can see we can pass a URL or we can pass an object for some options. Well, I'm going to put all of my options in an object. So the way I do that is open a left brace, and this creates a new object just by opening that brace. So the URL we're going to want to call is API/employees. And then the next thing we need to do is, if you remember, we were getting the content back as XML. Well, we want it back as JSON. And because with REST, we let the HTTP request define how it's going to get the data. So we want the content type for the request to be JSON. And jQuery makes this very easy. We can just say that the content type we want back is JSON. That's all we have to do. So the next thing that we want to do is create a success function, and this is the function that will be called when there is a successful result from the server, or the first server sends back a 200 response code, which is okay. Everything happened okay. Here's some data back, and the data that comes back will be contained in this data object. So the data object will hold an array of the employee objects in JSON format that we got from the Web API service. So we're going to want to iterate over each one of these and add a row to the table. To do that, I'm going to use the jQuery each function. Now, the jQuery each function is very similar to a for loop in C# or VB. And basically, we're going to iterate over each object in the data array, and we're going to call a function on each one of those objects. And inside of that function, we'll have access to the index or location of the item inside of the collection and the item itself. I don't really need index, but it's a parameter that's coming along for the ride. And then what I want to do is append a new table row onto this employees table. This variable represents the employees table, which is here in the page. I can do that using the append, which is a jQuery function, and I'm just going to append a string of HTML. And I'm concatenating here, and for each employee item, I can access the properties just by item.firstname and item.lastname. And that's the very nice thing about JSON serialization, is that when you get your data back, it's very easy to go ahead and construct a UI with it because it's very easy to understand its structure. So now that we've got all this created, let's go ahead and save this and check out the application. So the application loaded up and we got our results from the WCF service. But let's bring up the developer tools. If you remember, that's F12, the F12 developer tools. And I'm going to start turning the network, and I'll refresh the page. And you can see that besides the regular requests, we have a request that happened down here to the API employees endpoint. And you can see the type was application/JSON. And if I double click on this and we look at the response body, you can see that this is the JSON result that we got back. So very nice, very simple, very easy to do. But let's take this a step further and talk about doing some CRUD operations. I want to be able to delete one of these items from this list. So let's add a delete button and look at how we can implement that with the Web API and jQuery. Because I want to be able to delete each one of these items, I want to add a delete button here to this table row. But the first thing that stands out to me is that this is kind of ugly. I've got HTML mixed in with my JavaScript, and I just don't like this. I think I can do a better job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, and what I'm about to show you is probably the simplest and most basic form of something called templating in JavaScript and jQuery. So I'm going to create a block of HTML. And this block of HTML will be a div with an ID of template, and it's set to display none. So nothing inside of it will display. And what I want to do is I want to be able to create a table row that I've templated out here. So I've given the first name and last name a static width, and then I've added a button down at the bottom so everything lays out very nicely. And for each item in my data set, I want to create a new one of these rows, and I want to add that row to the table. Now I've wrapped this table row here in a table so that it validates in the schema. If I take this out, the schema won't validate, and I just don't like to see squiggly lines in Visual Studio. So let's go up and look at how we can create a templated row. I need a new row in the each function here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable, and it's going to be a jQuery variable, so we'll put a $sign in front and call it row. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select first the template, and this just selects this entire div block at the bottom. And then I'm going to do a find, and I want to find the class row template. You can see that that is the class for the table row that we want to use as our template. Now once I find that, I want to clone it. And what cloning it does is creates a new one and stores it in this row variable. And this is called chaining with jQuery. So as I'm chaining, I can call a method, and then I can call another method and another method all on the same line. And in that same vein, I want to create an ID for the row that's unique. And I can do that by setting its attribute of ID, and we'll set it to row underscore, and then what I'm going to do is concatenate in the item.id. So this whole row gives us a new table row, and what I can do now is I can start setting values in this table row. So if I say row and then I do find and I get the first name class, you can see that the first table column has a class of first name in the template. Then I can set its HTML to item.firstname. And I can do the same for the last name. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is I want to add a button click event to the delete button that will be out to the right. So I'll go ahead and I will find the delete button, which has a class of delete. If I scroll down here, you can see I can select it by its class. So I'll select this button here, and I'm going to add a click event. And when the button is clicked, I'm going to fire a function. And inside of that function, what I want to do is I want to make yet another Ajax call and delete this specific item from the server side, from the database. So I'm going to do another Ajax method, and in this Ajax method the URL is going to be very similar but just a tad different. So we're going to call API/employees, but what I want to do is I want to append the ID that I want to delete and make that part of the URL. And this helps us stay very RESTful in our implementation. So I'm just going to concatenate the item.id onto the end. And the next thing I want to do is I want to tell it that the type of HTTP request that I want to do is a delete. So with the URL and the HTTP verb delete, WebAPI will know to do a delete and to fire the correct method. And then I want to handle the success function as usual, and it won't be getting any data back, so I don't need a data variable. But in the success function, what I want to do is I just want to take this row that we've added and I want to remove it from the UI. And that helps keep the UI up to date with the database, which has just had a row removed. So I'm going to go ahead and close off this Ajax method. Then I can go ahead and remove the old way that we were doing it here. And close off the each function. There we go. And before we actually exit the each, what I want to do is I want to append this row to the table. So we're just going to say employees.append and this new row. So we've done some very basic templating here using a very manual method. There are frameworks and toolkits that make templating a whole lot easier and a whole lot better than what you've seen here, but this is just a brief introduction. So let's save this, and because we're using JavaScript, we don't need to recompile, and we'll head out to the application and do a refresh. And we've got a break, and I forgot to, or excuse me, mistyped a variable here. So I will break here, stop, add the S that it needs, since it is employees, I believe it is, and we'll give that another try. So nice debugging with Visual Studio and JavaScript. Now I can go ahead and start clicking these buttons, and you can see that nothing's happening here. But if I go to the Network tab and I click Start Capturing, you can see here when I click this button that a request is fired and the ID is appended onto the end, and it's a delete. And we get back a 405 result. And you can see that if I click these other buttons, we get similar results. And if I double click this 405, we can see here that the requested resource does not support HTTP method delete. That's the message back from WebAPI telling us that we need to implement a delete because it hasn't been implemented yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, I'm back in Visual Studio and I'm going to jump to the employees controller where we will implement the delete method. So I'm going to create a public method and it's going to be void. I'm not going to return anything. We'll let the server return the response that lets us know that everything happened okay. And I'll call this delete. And that's all I need to do to have it respond to the delete HTTP method. WebAPI will take care of that for us. And then I'm going to pass in the ID parameter that's coming along on the URL. And if you remember in the global file, we specified that there may or may not be an optional ID parameter here. And I'm going to go ahead and use that now. So now that I have the ID, I'm going to go ahead and select the employee to delete from the link to SQL context by its ID. That selects the employee for us. And I've gone ahead and said singular default, as this will pull back one item, as link to SQL by default returns things as a collection. And then I will just say from the context, we want to get the employees table and say that we're going to delete on submit this employees to delete object. And then we'll go ahead and say submit changes. Okay, there we go. Let's go ahead and run this and have another look at the application. I've added myself as an employee to the Northwind database so that I do not lose any of my very valuable Northwind data. And on the Network tab, I'm going to start capturing, and you'll see that when I click this button here, that the request is fired to the server with the ID, and it's delete, and it gives us a 200 saying that everything happens okay. And my name was removed from the list by jQuery. If we refresh the page, you'll notice that my name is still there, which is confusing. I thought that we got a 200 back saying the delete occurred okay. Well, it did, but it's important to know that we have some caching going on here. So if I click the cache tool and I say always refresh from server, and I click refresh, you'll see that my name is in fact gone. And I just wanted to show you that so that you know that you don't get bit by the cache, because that can be very confusing. So this has been a whirlwind tour through WebAPI, REST, JSON, and Ajax with jQuery. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time.